You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, we're back. Welcome to Where No Bugs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward, for the benefit of my son, Ben the Bear. But of course, we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there, so we're putting all of these out for free on YouTube. And welcome to Season 2. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing good, Jay. Welcome to Season 2. That's right.
It's pretty exciting that we're here. Still working on Season 1. I'm in the middle of editing those. Hopefully by the time before we get to the end of Season 2, those will be out. But, I think that there's a lot of interesting things that are happening already when we start at the beginning of this new season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. The production seems a lot slicker. There is, I think, a more cohesive but simpler storytelling taking place. I will get into more of the details about this episode, The Child, but there's really kind of a solidification in this episode that takes place very early on and very quickly, where everyone is placed in kind of these new roles that they're going to stay in for the rest of the show, and we also get the introduction of a new character.
Right. Well, actually, two.
Oh, that
because we got a replacement for Dr. Crusher.
Oh, that's right, we do. Well, I almost forgot about Dr. Pulaski, but I don't like Dr. Pulaski, but we'll get into that. So Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 1 is entitled The Child, which debuted on November 21st, 1988. And, talking about it here, I wanted to ask real quick, before we really dig in, what did you think of the episode, both from a perspective of a standalone episode, but also as the debut of a second season?
Well, it was interesting, since we hadn't talked about this, but I noticed also that the story was a lot tighter, just the way it was flowed and so forth. And I think that, a lot of shows like this that have different seasons, they'll try to have some last episode be definitive enough that it'll provide a segue into the next season. And I think if I recall, the last episode of Season 1, it didn't do that real well. But
no,
in terms
the neutral zone.
Yeah, as in terms of starting this new season now, I think they did a good job in that they, right at the beginning, kind of reoriented, the characters, the key people, and key things are that Geordi's now in the chief engineer role, so we're not going to have all these rotating characters. Mr. Argyle and the South Asian guy and so forth is the engineer. Dr. Crusher has become the head of Starfleet Medical and is replaced by Dr. Catherine Pulaski. Chief O'Brien shows up, and he, he's going to become a series regular. Yeah, he goes into other Star Trek shows, and probably really the most interesting one, important one, is Guinan.
Yes,
and
the introduction of Whoopi Goldberg.
Right, and she introduces herself through her interaction with Wesley, and she's very important with Beverly Crusher leaving the Enterprise and Wesley staying there. It gives the process of him going in and talking with Wesley and showing her skills of how to get people to self-examine where they are, it helps Wesley decide what he wants to do, and he has the interaction with Picard and so forth. So it just, anchors Wesley to the Enterprise, even with his mother not being there.
Right. So let's get into two things. First, the departure of Gates McFadden or Dr. Beverly Crusher. So in the storyline, Beverly Crusher has left the Enterprise D to become the head of Starfleet Medical, which is a very big deal. She's basically the Surgeon General of the galaxy.
Right, yes.
um, on the other hand, what's going on behind the scenes is that Gates McFadden had been essentially feuding with Maurice Hurley, who was the head writer of Star Trek The Next Generation, which was being produced under Gene Roddenberry. And Maurice Hurley went to Gene Roddenberry and said, I don't like Gates McFadden. Will you please fire her? We don't need her for season 2. Hire
Catherine Muldaur.
Catherine Mulder.
Yes.
Basically hire her and bring her in, and Gene Roddenberry acquiesced. And this was the time that Rick Berman, who's going to take over the show in 92 for season 3, enters the scene as well, and he doesn't do anything to fight Gene Roddenberry's firing of Gates McFadden or the hiring of Mulder as Dr. Catherine Pulaski. At the same time, while Gates McFadden is leaving, Whoopi Goldberg is a lifelong Star Trek fan and is a huge fan of The Next Generation. Whoopi Goldberg's fandom goes all the way back to the original series when she first saw Uhura, played by
Nichelle Nichols. Yeah.
Nichelle Nichols, as the comms officer Uhura. It was really important for Whoopi Goldberg because it was the first time that she saw a black character depicted on screen that wasn't in a subservient role, but was
and a black female character also.
A black female character, but was being played in a role where she was part of a team and served a very important function aboard the ship. And this started kind of a lifelong Star Trek fandom for Whoopi Goldberg, to the point where when she met Gene Roddenberry, she personally asked him to write her a role for the second season, which continued all the way into the movies, specifically Star Trek Generations. So this was also past the point where Whoopi Goldberg had won an Oscar. So her joining the cast is actually a very big deal at this point. But as you say, Chief O'Brien, Colm Meaney's played by the great Irish actor Colm Meaney, shows up. Geordi is now chief engineer, so there's no more different chief engineers. So goodbye, Captain Chief Engineer Argyle. And I think, didn't Chief Engineer Singh die?
Chief Engineer Singh did die, that's right. He was killed by somebody.
And then there was the last chief engineer who, had an initial in his name and had to tell Picard his full name.
Oh, right. And he was the one that, because he was senior to Geordi. He had to
reset the dilithium chamber.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
he had to realign the dilithium chamber. Sorry.
Right. Exactly.
But now Geordi is going to be down in engineering most of the time. He's not going to be at the helm. This is also, and I don't know if you've mentioned this already, but this is also the introduction of William T. Riker's most important asset on the show.
The beard.
The beard.
Yes.
So, let's spend some time.
Question. When you met
Frakes,
Jonathan Frakes at Dragon Con in Atlanta years ago, did he have a beard then?
Yes.
Okay.
He has a great beard.
Yes.
Here's the thing. I met Jonathan Frakes once. Very, very nice man. Very tall. Very, very tall. Very large man. Very jolly. Other than that, great beard. Just a nice dude to be around. But, I think with Riker taking on the beard, there is a little bit of a change to the character to where I was recently watching this interview, I think recorded around 93 or 94, where Jonathan Frakes is talking about like the maturation of the William Riker character.
Yeah, this is important because a lot of times in just drama, when a character grows a beard or shaves off a beard, it is a very visual way to demonstrate that there's a change in this person.
Yes. So before before he had the beard, Frakes was asked to play Riker in a very serious tone. Like there wasn't a lot of smiling, there wasn't a lot of joking. He was supposed to kind of be like Cary Grant and have this kind of cold glint in his eye. Apparently that's what Roddenberry asked him to do. But the second season he's allowed to grow the beard and he's allowed to show a little bit more humor, as we're actually going to see in this episode. And, I think kind of the softening and the more humorous side of William T. Riker finally comes out with the beard. And I think it's an important change to the character because beforehand there is kind of a. I think that there was kind of a utility to splitting Picard and Riker in terms of, you have a captain on the bridge and you essentially have a captain down on the ground in the way team. That's what Riker was. He was Kirk on the ground. Um, I think now you really do have kind of the solidification of, here's Jean Luc Picard, a captain, and here's his subordinate William T. Riker. And Riker's not as strident about Picard going down to the surface and joining away teams. It really is kind of a more, I won't say carefree William T. Riker, but a less. It
Less
seems like. Sorry, go ahead.
less rigid.
Less rigid. And
Uh-huh.
it seems like the William T. Riker from season one was more bound by following Starfleet regulation than this one was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, this one is more of the Yukon Yankee explorer
Mm-hmm.
than the
Mm-hmm.
guy without the beard was. The guy without the beard was the starship officer.
Right.
The guy with the beard is an explorer.
Well, and it gives the character a little bit more leeway, and he can more broadly play the role. Then,
Right.
yeah.
Um. Let's see. It's. Let's. Sorry,
Why
folks.
don't
I'm
you go
looking at our
ahead and
notes.
set up for the audience what the story is about?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That's what I'm in the midst of doing. It's been a week. So the USS Enterprise D is in the midst of a rendezvous with the USS Repulse. Commander Riker contacts the Repulse and lets them know they're underway. After the commanding officer of the other ship, tells Riker that there is. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place with my notes. There's Rakela system. Okay, so the USS Enterprise D is in the midst of a rendezvous with the USS Repulse, and as the USS Repulse shuttle leaves the Enterprise hangar bay, Riker contacts the Repulse and tells them that they're getting underway. The Repulse's command officer acknowledges and asks Riker to give his regards to Captain Picard. Riker goes to the ready room where Geordi LaForge is explaining to both Picard and Riker the containment module he's constructing in one of the ship's cargo bays. This containment module is being built to hold specimens of a plasma plague that the Enterprise is going to be transferring for research to the Rakela system in hopes of developing an antidote for it. Meanwhile, the new doctor has arrived on board, Dr. Catherine Pulaski. But as the ship's leaving, a mysterious light is seen to enter the Enterprise through the hull, travel throughout the ship, and ultimately settle into the womb of a sleeping counselor Troy, impregnating her with a mysterious life form. So that's a lot. And there's really kind of two storylines going on here. One is the story, which is kind of lightly dealt with, comparison to Deanna's pregnancy, but there's the story of the plasma plague and kind of trying to keep that contained and how they'll figure out its transport to the Raquel system. And then, of course, there's the sudden, almost immaculate conception of Deanna Troy, which has a lot of repercussions and actually has a lot of interesting ramifications immediately on board the ship. So let's actually get into the plasma plague first, because there's not. I feel like in terms of the and there's of course the third story of Wesley Crusher being told, but in terms of the stories I think that are being told here, I think the thinnest actually is the plasma plague. But there's some really interesting things to look at in terms of it. So so one of your notes I think was interesting. But before we get that, you did make the note. This is another situation where an epidemic defines a mission. In this case, a plasma plague. We last season we talked a good bit about how the exploration of space, if it was developed enough to the point where we had an organization like Starfleet or the Federation, and we had ships that had faster than light. You know, Along the way of exploring all of these planets, we were probably going to run into organisms, viruses, and bacteria that would probably prove to be an immediate threat to us as living biological organisms. I think your note here about how they're constantly running into an epidemic kind of highlights, again, the nature of a chaotic universe. Maybe not in the sense of like Star Trek doesn't deal with a lot of like interstellar phenomena, it seems, next to biological or even xenobiological phenomena or species or morphology, stuff like that. It seems very much that the chaos that you see in the universe of Star Trek is revolving around life, not necessarily, I think there's one episode where they're trying to like deflect an asteroid, but there's not a lot of like people worrying about asteroids running into planets or them running into other interstellar phenomenon. It really is built around like them dealing with civilizations or creatures or some sort of
Different life
organization.
forms. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
different life forms. And I just find it I just find that an interesting outlook in terms of the writers and Gene Roddenberry in terms of where they see the threats, or maybe the challenges going forward. Um, we're in the middle. We're kind of the tail end of an epidemic, right? Well, a pandemic right now, supposedly.
Supposedly.
It's May 13th, 2021. Um, the coronavirus has not necessarily slowed down, but we have developed a vaccine for it. A lot of us have gotten vaccinated. I will be vaccinated on the 23rd.
You get your
Fully
second
vaccinated.
dose. Yeah,
Yeah,
fully.
my
Right.
second dose. I'll be fully vaccinated on the 23rd. But there is a lot of uncertainty about what happens going forward in terms of how we act as a culture and as a society. Um, there's also a question of the origins of the coronavirus, which I think we kind of have to talk about because it kind of relates a little bit to this episode here. Because when we finally examine or have a chance to examine um,
Plague.
the plasma plague,
And I don't think they say whether I put virus in my notes, but I don't think they ever say whether it's a virus or a bacteria, do they?
um, So the note that you made in the notes that you prepared, Dr. Pulaski comments about someone playing with a viral strain to see how
Oh,
bad it could
it
be.
was a virus. That's right. That's where it came from. Yeah, right.
So it's very clear that that this plasma plague was created artificially, and that it was probably some researcher creating something just to see what they could do or test the bounds of something else, which happens a lot in the development of all sorts of medications and chemicals. You develop one thing just to see how it reacts to other things. That happens. Um, we bring this up because right now in 2021, there's a question about the origins of the coronavirus in terms of how it was propagated from its place of origin in Wuhan, China. Originally, we were told that this virus mutated within a bat, and that this bat was sold on in the wet markets of Wuhan, where they sell live animals for consumption. That this bat was ultimately butchered, cooked, and consumed by someone, and upon that consumption, they contracted the coronavirus or COVID
Well, so
19,
humans
and
would have the virus would have been transferred from a living non-human species while it was still
so
alive.
so would it have been like the bat sneezing, or would it have been
Just
someone eating the bat?
just bat saliva. I think if you cook the bat, you're going to kill the virus. So it's when you're handling the bat and you get some bodily fluid on it, something a nasal secretion of some sort. That's what it would that would make the transfer to the humans.
What about blood? Well, not blood then.
I don't think it's bloodborne. No, it's no. This
Okay.
is not a bloodborne. Coronavirus is not bloodborne. No,
See, this is why I brought you. You can help with the
right.
science. Um,
But
but
the
now
point.
we're getting into the conversation of many virologists, including the former head of the CDC, Robert Redgrave, and 200 other scientists, have recently signed a document suggesting, or they claim, not suggest, but they claim that the COVID-19 virus looks like it was created within a laboratory. And if that is the case, it brings up a lot of moral and ethical questions in the real world that we are going to have to deal with in 2021.
Well, it's a very good point because I think what it goes
But
back
it's
to something.
connected to this. It's
Oh, it
connected
is.
here to the plasma plague. But
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
it goes back to what something we've popped up in several times during season one. What that book I read in my freshman year of college about the social responsibility of the scientists,
Right.
and I think there's not there's very important moral, ethical, um, medical,
Mm-hmm.
political issues to be considered when you play with biology and try to do it differently. Um, creation of I mean, back during the Cold War, we know that the Russians invested very heavily in biological weapons. We did too, I'm sure. There are probably entities that, if Al Qaeda or ISIS had the capability to launch a bio attack in the West, in the United States, they would do it. You have the issue of, the ethics of in vitro fertilization,
Mm-hmm.
brings up, moral, religious issues and so forth. Um, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
there's some stem cell therapies that have been used um, without institutional review board approval, without good science, where patients have been harmed. Like some people have had some types of stem cell transplants to treat retinal disease, and they become irreversibly blind. So, you know, it, for those who don't understand how medical advances work, going back to the 70s, it really became that you had to have universities set up institutional review boards so that if a researcher wanted to do research using human subjects, they had to submit data and their plan to that board to consider whether it was safe, whether it fit
Mm-hmm.
in with the medical principle of do no harm, whether it was based on good science. Um, so it goes back to sort of the uh, experiments that the Nazis did and the Japanese did on prisoners and concentration camp people, and of course the United States had some deal with that when they took a number of people in Tuskegee and in Alabama back right after World War II, I think it was, and infected them with syphilis and let them go on to have neurosyphilis just so they could understand how bad the disease would get,
Mm-hmm.
which was totally immoral and unethical and wrong. So the point here is that what Dr. Pulaski brings up and what you're bringing up is the whole issue of as we make advances in biology with stem cell therapy, cellular therapy in general, and gene therapy, we have to be very careful in as to what we are doing.
I think it's not. I agree. We have to be very careful in what we're doing, but there also has to be. She makes the point of this virus is someone playing to see how bad it could be. We have to find some sort of restraint in ourselves to. The question of how bad it could be has to be handled in a way that doesn't actually require creating something of such vast lethality. It seems crazy to me, and maybe this is where I see the problem with the story in this episode, because I like this episode for a number of reasons, but it's not the strongest episode. And I think narratively it's not the strongest episode because there's some world building things that I don't understand. And one of them is what Pulaski brings up here. Someone was playing to see how bad this could be. You know, this in this future, Star Trek is based a lot of their technology, at least in Starfleet, on modeling. And it seems kind of crazy to me in this advanced future where AI can basically model the pathology of a virus for you and show you how it is going to mutate and change, that someone would take the time to actually take the virus and mutate it and change it itself. It seems like whoever created this plasma plague is probably a criminal and is probably in the Starfleet equivalent of a jail. And like what this mission is really is a cleanup, because what happened is someone did something very, very wrong. And we just don't have the information to be said that like it's very, very wrong, because otherwise, like, why would Starfleet let this happen?
Well, it's the story's kind of incomplete there because remember they mentioned that there was an outbreak of this plasma plague or a similar version of it on another planet in the past. So it's been around. They know about what this virus is, but it doesn't that doesn't negate the point that you're making here.
Well, it also brings up the question of, okay, in the future, if and I completely forgot that point, but you're right. The virus had sprung up someplace originally and then reappeared on another planet. How are these viruses being transmitted planet to planet? Like, is someone getting on a ship and taking it from one place to another via like contraband? Are they carrying the virus within themselves as an asymptomatic carrier? Like, how are these viruses moving from planet to planet? I can, here on Earth in 2021 with the coronavirus and with all viruses now, I think we have a very good understanding about how these things can move from continent to continent. But I
Well,
think
I
the
mean,
actual
if you want to be very nefarious, you can actually take many viruses and dehydrate them and actually
Mhm.
turn them into a salt form, so that you could put them in a vial as a powder, and then you could, put it in your suitcase and transport it from, Hong Kong to San Francisco or wherever, and then you could rehydrate it and put it into a cell culture to get it to grow, or rehydrate it and spread it into humans, and as an aerosol or however it's transmitted.
welcome to where no Bubs has gone before, where we teach you how to commit terrorism.
Well, look, you can Google it, or you can go on tour and get onto the dark web and talk to people how to do it. So
Or
you'd
you
have
could
a,
just let my dad. You just
or
let my
no, no,
dad
no,
tell you how to do
but
it.
those people on the dark web, they'll know a lot more about it than I do.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Trust me, they will. Um, but hell, when you put it up like that, I think one thing that you would have to really worry about in the future, especially if you had an interstellar community, was biological terrorism. I actually do think that that would be a bigger problem than maybe someone collecting like a armada of ships and attacking a planet. Because depending on what planet you attack, Starfleet could show up and kick your ass. But you could
Well,
also attack a planet where they also have their own standing military force. It
we
seems like dropping a biological weapon or a virus on a planet is a great way to really spread fear and cause
well the
chaos.
whole
If I
discussion
was a
of
bad person in the 24th century.
different microbes possibly being infectious to a different species on a different planet. I mean, in the original Enterprise series, the NX-01, they had a biofilter, and they had a decontamination process. And now we've mentioned this in season one, that the Enterprise, the transporter, has a biofilter mechanism built in.
Right.
Um, and if you really think about it in terms of the importance of microbes in H.G. Wells' um, you know,
War of the Worlds, yeah.
War of the Worlds, what saved humanity were microbes, because
It
the Martians had no immunity to mic. It's the same what happened with the coronavirus. This virus showed up. Humans had never been exposed to it. Our immune system did not know what to do with it. Some people became asymptomatic with it. Some people became slightly ill. Some became moderately ill, and a number of people became very ill. I read an article today that they think that the total number of people on the planet who died is somewhere, I think, between 7 and 13 million at this point.
Jesus.
But that's
Ugh.
not that's I mean the 1918 flu supposedly was like 50 million.
Oh
So we're
yeah.
a long way from that, but that 7 to 13 million is a lot of unexpected deaths around the
Well,
globe.
the Black Plague killed a third of Europe
That's right.
in a short amount of time.
That's right.
So like in many ways, and if anyone's listening to this, I'm not taking COVID-19 or what happened or so many people who've died from this terrible virus and still suffer from this disease, because one one group we're not talking about are the people that survived the disease, or that are going to be suffering long-term ramifications from it in terms of
Right.
their
And and, and
health
we and we
outcomes.
and we probably don't understand how persistent those long term symptoms are still.
Right. But even then, if putting in the perspective of the numbers that you mentioned with the Spanish flu being 50 million, the Black Plague being a third of the entire European population, in many ways we were very lucky to get off as
Hmm.
lightly as we did.
Well, we have had the medical technology, particularly in the West, to you know address it.
I wonder what you know. They're building this containment unit for this plasma plague to transport it on the Enterprise in a cargo bay, and it's very clear that like this has to be done delicately because the containment unit itself is very fragile, that they have to even bring their own engineer. And he seems to be an engineer, but he also seems to be a virologist himself.
Something like that. Yeah.
Let me get his name. He's
Lieutenant Commander something or other.
yeah. He has a fantastic mustache and haircut.
He does, yes.
Let me look at the cast notes here. They're right here on our go-to. Yeah, Hester Delt, Lieutenant
That's
Commander
right.
Hester Delt,
Yes.
with this great mustache and blonde shag of hair.
Kind of grayish. Yeah, right.
Yeah, kind of. Now, do you know what? One thing I noted earlier last season was that there is not a real sense of ageism in the future when it comes to the kind of people that work for Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Dr. Pulaski, uh, Lieutenant Commander Hester here, Jean-Luc Picard. There are a lot of people who are, kind of past their 40s and past their 50s who are who are active part of the service.
Well,
Going into the
you
future.
see
And
what
I
you
think that says something interesting about like their health outcomes and their
mm-hmm.
health capabilities
Mm-hmm.
in the future, that, physically they're still able and they're still able to obtain and maintain their commissions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that says something interesting about their society still. And I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to.
Yeah, well, you see the what you'd expect that when you see some of the higher ranking Starfleet officers, the admirals, they're older, which
Mm-hmm.
you'd expect, just like we see now. We're
Uh,
generals and our admirals and so on.
one
Although
thing that
I actually think a lot of I don't know if our generals are younger than they were in the past, but
I would have to, from what I have followed in the media since I've started following these kind of things, they usually seem to be in their early 50s to early
yes,
60s.
yeah, mm-hmm.
But I think, like, kind of getting back to Star Trek, Jean-Luc Picard is technically 70 when this is being filmed. That
Mm-hmm.
character's 70 years old. So if Riker's like, let's say Riker's like in his mid 30s in this episode, it wouldn't be crazy for him to become captain around maybe 50. Because, Jean-Luc Picard was captain of the Stargazer for like a couple decades before that. So being captain is, the actual process of promotion in Starfleet, I think, has to be an interesting one when you consider that your career includes the fact that you have, because it's the future and because of their health, their level of health care, your career is going to be longer because your life is going to be longer. And I think that that's a very interesting way to look at kind of the possible impacts of what our culture will be going forward, because we're already talking about 4-day work weeks. And you brought up in your notes, Picard talks about relieving Riker and showing that the bridge is a 24-hour job like a ship at sea. I think that's interesting because it not only brings up the fact that, Picard and Riker are probably switching off, including with Data, because it's shown in later seasons that Data actually takes the night shift for command. But I think the nature of work with an elongated lifespan is probably going to be very different in terms of not only the hours we work, but the nature of how we chart our careers. You know, we kind of have the sense that after we get out of college, we're going to be done by the time we're 60,
Mm-hmm.
around that 60, 65.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, now in our current economy, most people won't retire. But in Star Trek, the idea of retiring at 65 is probably, this kind of farcical idea, because for them, that might be the middle of their career.
Or they're going to do something else.
Yeah. Well, it brings into light the kind of conversation Picard has with the banker in the neutral zone in the last episode for the season finale, where
Right. Yeah.
The real goal of the future is the betterment and enrichment of yourself as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that becomes, I think Starfleet allows you to be a service to like your greater interstellar community. But like you say, you're with your elongated life, you get to go on and do something else afterwards. It says something special about the future that we've been able to, at least on Earth it seems, we've been able to afford each other the ability to not only have a life of labor and meaningful work, but then a life of meaningful personal exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is, I don't think that is a utopian. I don't think that is a utopian impossibility. I
Mm-hmm.
think that we have the ability to do that in the long term. It's just a question of figuring out and organizing. And I think Picard says this very well in, the last episode of the last season. It really does become about what we prioritize
Mm-hmm.
as a species. So, um, jumping
To Troy
around,
and
yes, let's.
her immaculate conception.
So this life, this life form, impregnates Troy, and immediately it begins to gestate and mature to where she has the baby essentially 36 hours later.
Yes.
In this kind of like miraculous scene where like Data's there witnessing, kind of taking on the father's role and being there supportive of Troy. William Riker's watching in the background because he does show this initial jealousy, kind of hinting to the long-standing relationship between he and Troy and kind of the expectations they have.
When they're underway and Picard realizes that the new medical officer has not reported to him, and he asks, "Where is she?" "She's in 10 forward." He thinks, "Well, what the hell is she doing in 10 forward?" So he goes himself.
Getting drunk.
And Guinan points out that Dr. Pulaski is talking to Deanna Troi. And she stands up and introduces herself. And, Dr. Pulaski is a very, I would say, business-oriented physician, gets right down to it. Although she has her humor, too, as shown as how she's trying to adapt to working with data. And we'll
you call
get to
him
that point.
You call him Data. Don't call him Data.
I know. We'll get to that point. But then she immediately explains what's happened to Deanna, and he then has everybody come to the ready room, the conference room, and when it's announced that Deanna's pregnant, Riker immediately like since he has a relationship with her, like, well, who did you sleep with? How did that happen? And and has
it
that
gets into
sort
my
of
long.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
He has almost a jealous reaction.
I have a long-standing fan theory that's headcanon to me. So I think in the future there's a lot more polyamorous relationship and a lot more open sexual relationship between even friend groups. Not even like they're having romantic relationships. I just think that we get to the point where like contraception and our ideas about sexuality and our ideas about sexual relations mature to where it's not like the free love that the hippies were talking about in the 60s, but
right.
but
I
there's just a
understand.
more like sex is a much more casual thing, and like procreation has a lot more, I guess, weight to it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially since getting back to our conversation with having an elongated life in Picard, Troy and Riker have children much later in life than I think they would be able to biologically in today's world. Um, I think so getting to my theory, I think during this entire show leading up to about season 5 when Troy and Worf start kind of forming their own relationship, I think Troy and Riker are sleeping together the entire time. Those entire first 4 seasons, they're basically having an open relationship. And I think it's confirmed because like there's this I think it's season 3 where like they spend a day together in Beta Z, and like they're walking through the gardens and they're making out with each other, and that's my basic theory is like these two have been basically together the entire
Well,
time.
she,
They're just
in the
not saying it.
first season, she refers to him 2, if not 3 episodes, refers to him as Imzadi. You know,
Yeah.
the very personal, dear love Betazoid word. So the thing that was really interesting also about that conference they had in the Ready Room, in the conference room, since this was in 1988, of course, the whole controversy about
Yes.
abortion is coming up. I thought the way they handled that, at least the way I interpreted it very well, in that, they're having a discussion as to whether this entity, this birth, this pregnancy is, since it's so abnormal, whether it's a threat to the ship. And some are saying, well, then we should abort it. And, we can,
Worf says that they should abort it.
right. And, Deanna seems to be having some sort of Betazoid like communication. Or actually, I think that the entity, the fetus, was talking to Deanna and telling her that I'm more than you think. And it ended up being that she wanted to have the child. So it's very much, it wasn't an anti abortion discussion. It was a pro choice discussion, because soon as Deanna said, Captain, I'm going to have this baby, he said, well, that's it. The discussion's at an end. So,
Yes.
I thought it was very interesting how they handled that, because it respected the, Deanna could have gone either way. So it ended up being respectful of the pregnancy, but still also kind of supported a pro-life, a pro-choice stand, I thought.
Well, I think when you have to deal with the difficult conversation of an abortion, especially when it takes place in like a TV show or a movie or even a book, there's a lot of being blunt about it. If you're on the right politically and you're talking about abortion, at the end of the day, you think the people that are getting abortions are basically baby killers. On the left, you're looking at the people on the right and saying that these people basically want to subjugate and enslave a woman's body. Neither one is exactly true. Because on one hand, when you do eliminate the fetus through an abortion, you are eliminating something that has the potential for life. It's not alive, but it does have the potential for life. And I still, even though I am pro-choice, I think there is a possible ethical dilemma there. I don't know what it is because scientifically speaking and spiritually speaking, I don't know. I don't think we still know when life is conceived or
Well,
when consciousness begins.
just the way you articulated what you just said, some people would vehemently argue with you, because it all comes back to, when does life actually
Exactly.
occur? And you and I have talked about this personally, that over the years, there's been a shift from, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't until, like several months in or so forth. And now it's gone to the point that, it's at the point of conception, that it's a living
Yeah.
being and so forth. And, that, how do you scientifically from an ethical standpoint, you can make that argument, but can you scientifically support that? I mean, that's where the controversy comes in for people who are totally pro-life versus those that are pro-choice.
Well, it supposes an immediacy and a primacy of consciousness to something that we can't measure in terms of its ability to show consciousness. Like, you can't really look at the zygote and say, hey, how do you feel? Or what do you think of, life or death? Or any of these things, because, when we're really talking about, I think when we're talking about ending life in this way, and, those people who are pro-life say that we're murdering babies or we're murdering fetuses, it's under the assumption that we're murdering people that have a choice, or somehow consciousness, or somehow conscious of what's going on to them. And like I said, it's ethically it's really a minefield because there's so much we just don't know. But on the other hand, I think that a woman takes on so much risk, even, you know, a woman takes on so much risk with pregnancy. And in a world where it's set up to, I'm just of the opinion that the world, especially economically, has been set up to endanger women, especially black women. But when you look at the impact a woman has on a child's life as a mother, or just any person that has to fill that feminine motherly role for a child, I think that the responsibility that a woman has to exert on her own sovereignty places her at such a moral and ethical dilemma that I can't make the choice for her as a man, and I don't think you can, or a church can, or a government can. I think the only person that can make that choice for her is her, and maybe her doctor. Which is ultimately why, I think you're right. Picard really does, and I think this scene in the conference room really is kind of this pro-choice moment that Star Trek is putting forth, because ultimately it's Deanna who has to make the decision and bear the consequences of it. And there's an immediate recognition of that. And I think that's important in the future, not only from, I know someone will see that, many people will see this from a feminist perspective, which that's very much the case. But I think from a humanist perspective, I think it's very important that we recognize the sovereignty of individuals over deciding their biological futures. And that's what Picard does here.
And I think that they were ended up being respectful of the life aspect as well.
Well, it's just so difficult because, a lot of it, and we've talked about this with coronavirus, but we've also talked about this with other things that both within Star Trek and outside of Star Trek. Death is such a psychological hurdle for people, not just for themselves, but when it comes to dealing with the death of other beings, even if it's their pet. Death is such a, pardon my language, but it's late at night. Death is such a mindfuck that I don't think that there is a way to sensibly talk about certain things like abortion, because at the end of the day, something is coming to an end. And I think as humans, we have a natural inclination to be uncomfortable with that. And until we have... Do you know what makes this scene special in the conference room? There's not... Besides Deanna worrying about the implications of this pregnancy, there's no discomfort in her asserting her authority over her body. And there's no discomfort over her decision. And there's no discomfort about what to do.
Right.
There's discomfort from Riker because, he's jealous in terms of the relationship he has with her. Mm-hmm. there might be some discomfort from the crew in terms of like, okay, what are we facing in terms of a challenge towards the Enterprise?
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to like, what are we going to do with Deanna and what are we going to do with this life form? There's no hesitation that they're going to try to provide the best for both of them.
Right. Well, then to talk about
and I don't think we're there culturally yet.
No.
Here in 2021, but I think in the 24th century, it's very clear that they've gotten there.
Right. The other interesting thing about this is the whole thing was, since like we were joking that this is an immaculate conception, it's like, okay, is this how Mary was impregnated and how Jesus came to be? And, not to really get into the depth of that at all, but I think the important point is just as this life form, which is very much energy, which we've seen similar types of life forms in season 1, very, very wise in that it, impregnated a human, was born, had, the biological...
Impregnated a humanoid it could talk to.
Right. And it, and then it could control its biology so it matured very fast, so that the point is that it could understand humans by becoming human. And I thought it was interesting because one of the things that's talked about Christ is, God becoming incarnate, apart from the whole carrying away of sin, the Lamb of God and so forth, is, was Christ has an immaculate conception, was that really God taking on flesh so he could better understand what it would be as his creation?
So before we started recording this episode, folks, Dad and I were talking about the show Lucifer, which he and my mother are watching right now. They're at... Did you say you're in
beginning
season 3?
Of season 2.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Are we season 3? Beginning of season 3. Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm also working on a urban fantasy novel called The Trials of St. Patrick, though that title is probably going to be changing here soon to The Blessed and Possessed. But, one of the big things in the novel that I'm dealing with is Lucifer's confusion of God taking the flesh in the form of Christ, and the point that he had in doing that. And, it's interesting you bring up this entire idea of God taking the form of Christ to experience mortal death and finally probably gain an ultimate understanding of his own creations. I think that is both... I think that there's some validity to that view, and I think Ian is definitely like that kind of character. Like, he's definitely taken on a biological form to explore the material universe as he sees it, because it's very clear that he has access to the immaterial universe in some way, shape, or form. Or at least he has... I don't know. I would imagine if you're a being of light like him, because he is presented as like this creature of light at the very beginning of the episode when he arrives. And even when he leaves, like when he leaves Ian's bot, like the Cermeculum or the flesh bot or the flesh body, he disappears, or it disappears as this little ball of light that Troy can actually hold in her hands. So I would have to imagine, like, being a being of light, you're both in the material universe, but also kind of in a universe to itself, because who knows how light perceives light,
Well, and it just the one tie into the whole plasma plague story is that when they finally have the virus contained in the hold, and there's that one cell where it's rapidly growing and it's going to burst out of the containment vessel. Ian, as the representative of this entity,
right,
realizes that whatever biological control he has over his body growing, maturing so quickly and so forth.
Because he emits a
Obviously
radiation.
he's producing this type of radiation that is causing the problem, and he is responsible enough to realize that it's time for me to go because I'm going to do harm here. And as you said, he dies. He chooses to physically die his body, but then he turns back into his original form, and he goes into uh, um, Troy's palms, and there's seems to be some sort of communication between mother and child at that time.
Well, I have to say that this is, sticking with Troy and her pregnancy and, her kind of taking on this Mary like role. We've talked for a second about Jesus and kind of the Immaculate Conception and what the ramifications of Christ's, God taking the taking the flesh as Christ and what the ramifications are of that. One thing that I don't think that we are looking at in this episode is first, Marina Sirtis puts on a great performance throughout the entire episode. But second, this
Yes.
I actually came away from this episode thinking a lot about Mary, Jesus' mother, because it's one thing to watch your child be, you have this miracle child all of a sudden, but then you know that he is going to die um, before, what you think is going to be his natural time. While at the same time you have this child that contains this power, but you love this child because this child is your own, because this, Ian is basically Deanna's DNA. There's no fatherly DNA involved there, which makes me wonder, if we went back to the Levant during the Bronze Age, or the the late Iron Age at that point, when Christ was walking around and we did a DNA test of him, would Joseph's DNA show up in there, or would it just be Mary's DNA? I know that's a stupid
We'll never
question, but
know, right?
but
Yes.
I found it interesting that Ian's DNA was
Oh,
just fully
you
Deanna's.
just create you just created a whole new idea of going to the Shroud of Turin and finding whether there's any DNA embedded in the cloth.
Oh no, they've already looked into that. There isn't. It's someone
There isn't.
else's
Okay,
DNA.
what took care of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but that would have been cool, right? Cloning Christ from that cloth. Um, we're getting off track. Anyway, you know, I think that the alien entity wanting to explore and go through kind of childhood and go through the sensory experience being human, but also go through like there's also this relationship that Ian goes through with Deanna, where Deanna really is his mother for as long
Mm-hmm.
as he's there on the ship,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's just gone. He's just dead. And we started recording the show for Ben, my son, and your grandson. And when I watched this episode a second time, I reflected for a moment, like how traumatic it would be if he had just shown up and like someone had given me this baby. And let's say I just had this baby for 3 months, 90 days. But in 90 days, I had this baby and I learned to love this baby and that this baby's mine and that this is my son and I'm going to take care of him. I'm his parent now. And then at 90 days, nope, mom, nope, dad, I'm sorry. People are in danger. I just have to die and go. I'm literally going to croak in front of you right here on your bed. And then goodbye. Um, just the trauma that Deanna has to go through in this episode has to be something
I thought of that.
extraordinary.
I thought of that, but I think that the saving grace for her was when Ian reverted back into his energy
Right.
form, his light form, that when she held him, that's where there was some communication that he was telling her that thank you. And I think he did say that. And he probably said more than that, that thank you for being my mother, my parent. I'm really not gone. I'm just going back to my natural state. So that would, you know, again, this is a fictitious story, but I think that would help Deanna a lot.
Yeah. Well, you made the note of like this is one of the nicest first contact
Yes, right.
experiences because this is a first
A first
contact
contact.
experience.
Yeah.
Though it's the reverse first contact, and it gets into an interesting question about the Prime Directive and its utility. The Prime Directive is there to stop the Federation from getting in contact with pre-warp civilizations. If
Hmm.
you have an organism that doesn't have a civilization, but it wants to get in contact with us, it doesn't necessarily have any laws or any sort of system or
Oh,
scheme in place to stop it.
that's a real interesting point. Is that what is it if for a more advanced civilization? What's its prime directive?
Or what is it? What's its sense of law?
Well, that
Like as it retains to like in terms of the treatment of other individuals.
this entity seemed to be a very responsible, caring one. As where you go to Q, it's like, does the Q continuum have a prime directive of any sort?
Well, we're assuming that Ian is responsible and caring because Ian is benign and responsible and caring in terms of like the results of what happens to Deanna.
Right.
What if you had an organism or a being that showed up? Like, what if we rewrote this episode where like, okay, this light shows up, it impregnates Deanna, she has Ian, but Ian is evil. Like, what if you had a kind of a being like that was floating through the universe that
Worf would have been saying, I told you we should have terminated the pregnancy. Right.
but I think that that is a possibility too that you would have to face in the Star Trek universe traveling through space that if you have a quote unquote good entity like Ian that can impregnate someone and have this material existence for a time and then disappear, you could also have a malevolent entity that could
That's
impregnate someone,
yeah. That's a
but
very
then
good
why would they
count.
disappear?
That's a very good counterpoint. Yes.
And if Ian was that malevolent character, and they knew that like this plasma plague was going to be exposed on the Enterprise, wouldn't they try to help facilitate that? Maybe you really it kind of gets into the question of spirits. I don't know how much of DS9. Have you finished DS9?
No, I haven't at all.
Did you get into any of the stuff about the Pa Wraiths?
No, I don't know anything about that.
So the Pa Wraiths are basically the Pa Wraiths are basically the Bajoran demons
Huh.
of the religion. There's the prophets that live in the basically the wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant. That is the prophets' realm, and the prophets are the good entities that help the Bajoran people see their way through the troubled times of the Cardassians and all the challenges that they
Mm-hmm.
face. The Pa Wraiths are basically evil spirits that are trying to corrupt the Cardassians away from the prophets. The Pa Wraiths can actually move through space and possess other people. It seems to me like Ian, for a time, possessed Deanna's genetic material long enough to create a body for himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Sticking into the realm of science fiction, not getting into spiritualism or religion or any conversation about angels and demons, I think the appearance of Ian actually raises a lot of kind of really perplexing questions about the nature of life in the universe. If um, we've had other creatures take possession of characters in Star Trek before, but having a creature that can take possession of genetic material and forge its own body for itself really is kind of it really is kind of an existential thing to run into that I think has far greater repercussions than this episode is paying.
Well, it does, but keep in mind there is something called parthenogenesis, where
Mm-hmm.
you have some species of wasp that actually reproduce without asexual reproduction, and they just take whatever their genome is. I don't remember how it exactly works, but they just basically reproduce themselves. And I think there's been some work done that you might be able to, in mammalian cells, cause parthenogenesis with some sort of electric charge or something along those lines. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. So uh, two more things, since we've kind of covered the bulk of Deanna and we've covered the plasma plague. Let's cover Dr. Pulaski and Data real quick.
Sure.
So as I previously stated, I don't like Dr. Pulaski. And you're going to hear this a lot this season, that, like, I just don't like her. The main reason I don't like her is because she's so disrespectful to Data, like, on a consistent basis. And it starts with, like, not pronouncing his name correctly,
Right.
and him having to go, like, no, this is my name. This is how I'm pronouncing it. It's not Data, it's Data.
Right.
I just don't like. I understand the humor, and sometimes it's funny, but there's a part of me that's just like, stop being mean to Data, you bitch.
Right.
So, like, I don't know. How do you feel about her kind of anti? I don't want to call her a Luddite because she's clearly using all this technology around her, but, like, she's very hostile to Data from the beginning.
Is she on for just one season or two?
Yes.
One?
Yeah, she's just here for season 2.
Well, I'll have to see how in a future season 2 episode she behaves, because I don't remember. But my only comment about how she relates to Data during this episode is his commentary, his admonition back to her to pronounce his name correctly. Again, just emphasizes his actual humanness, along with
Right.
his wanting to experience human birth so that he's there to support Deanna when she's having Ian.
Which is a very sweet moment.
Right.
It
It is.
I think the problem that I have is just, I think that there is such a lack of, I think there's a lack of chemistry between, like, the actors in this case. Like, Brett Spiner can make, as Data, Brett Spiner can turn anything that character is given into gold.
Mm-hmm. He really
But
does.
Absolutely. But I think for the Pulaski character, she just never finds a good rhythm with anyone, it seems, in this episode. Even Captain Picard, like, there starts to be, like, there's this immediate antagonism that's going to carry through the season where it seems like Picard doesn't like Pulaski. And it starts in this episode where he's like, well, she found 10 forward before she found sickbay. But then, like, there's this kind of awkward, like, oh, nice to meet you, and...
Well, now that we're just into the first episode of season 1, I'll keep this in mind. So that
Season 2,
knowing that you just intensely dislike Dr. Pulaski, we can come whenever she shows up in a meaningful way in an episode. We can talk about how big of a bitch she's been in this episode to people.
Well, like, she's just so, like, there's this one comment that she makes that's just so out of hand where, Data volunteers to be there for Troy when Troy's having the baby, and Pulaski says, like, well, sorry, Commander, she needs more than the cold hand of technology to comfort her in this moment.
Yes.
And I'm just sitting here like, okay, this is the ship's counselor. This is the second in command of the ship, because Riker's first in command, Data's second in command. These people have been together for longer than you've been on this ship. And,
Right.
like, you're treating this friendship like it doesn't matter.
Right.
And I think that's the real turnoff for me.
Right.
Like, it's this just
Sure.
kind of automatic dismissal of Data as kind of a human being. Not even a human being, but just a creature of dignity. I think this is
She
where my humanism's coming in.
well, she's an android racist.
Exactly. Do you know what? I use the term Luddite, but Luddite being kind of this people that are kind of anti-technological progress.
Right.
But I do think that in the future, if AI were to be able to be embodied in the form of an android like Data, there is a part of me, and they touched in it in the first episode of Picard, because in the first episode of Picard, androids are still being used for a period for things like construction. They're shown being used to
Right.
help with the construction of ships on United Planitia, on Mars. I think that's where United Planitia is. I think it's on
Yes,
Mars.
it is. Yeah.
Um, it wouldn't surprise me if and they've kind of hinted at it with Data's story, and they will later on, but like, if Data doesn't face this form of discrimination that looks a lot like racism,
Mm-hmm.
and it will and I think, as we go forward in our world, and we've started to incorporate cybernetics into our biological into our own biological structure. Like, for example, if you look at people who are losing limbs now in like war
Mm-hmm.
areas, and
Mm-hmm.
just the advancement we're making now in prosthesis,
Mm-hmm.
The line between flesh and blood and cybernetics is going to be blurred as we go forward into the future. I can see there being a certain level of discrimination between people who consider themselves better because they are of natural flesh and blood versus those who have been cybernetically or biologically enhanced, versus people who are of flesh and blood being completely discriminatory to something like an AI or an android like Data. Maybe Pulaski is part of a group of people in the future that kind of harbor these kind of anti-AI, anti-android feelings, that the actual
Mm-hmm.
embodiment
Mm-hmm.
of technology in the form of a humanoid is
Mm-hmm.
anathema to their philosophy of
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's what's going on here.
Right.
And maybe like this is the first time we're seeing it.
Could be. Yes.
You know, one thing about this episode, and this is where we will end it here, there's the question of Wesley Crusher's future on board the Enterprise, because with his mother gone and him supposedly or supposed to be going to apply to Starfleet Academy, there's a real question on whether or not he can remain on board the Enterprise, and ultimately is decided that he's going to. And they have this really touching moment on the bridge where they ask, well, what's going to be done? And I think Picard asks, no, Riker asks, well, who will tuck him in at night? And Wesley looks back at Commander Riker and goes, come on, Commander. And Worf playfully says, I will accept that responsibility.
Yes, right.
It's this really nice moment where, it solidifies them as this family, because
Yes, it does. Right.
we've gone through the death of Tasha Yar. We just went through this kind of traumatic scene with Deanna. Keeping Wesley aboard after the loss of Beverly Crusher's definitely been a blow to a lot of people. It seems like it's actually been a little bit of a blow to Picard, too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this episode ends in a really nice way where, it still kind of puts forward Wesley Crusher as this wonder kid, which is a theme that started in the first season. But it keeps Will Wheaton on the show. But it also gives, I think, that banter that we were talking about, brought about by Riker's beard. Like,
Hmm.
there's a humor I think set in this first season that that was set in the first episode of this second season that we didn't see a lot of, if at all, in the first season. The first
Right.
season doesn't
Right.
feel very humorous
Right.
compared to this episode.
Yes.
I
Yes.
was just wondering if you noticed that too.
I did. Yeah. Yeah. I think it has to
Um,
do with, there, like I said, I think that when we ended the neutral zone, we talked about how's the second season going to, play out. And we talked about that. Well, the writers are going to take a break and say, okay, we're finished the first season. They probably had some little temporal break as to when they, needed to complete those shows and shoot them and so forth. So they probably, sat down and reassessed, how do we want to do things differently? How can we make it better, for the audience and so
you
on.
know, as a debut episode for a second season, if we put the child versus the encounter at Farpoint,
Mm-hmm.
it's very clear that the child is a much stronger episode narratively than the encounter at Farpoint. Even though it introduces Q and kind of sets the tone for the show, like the encounter at Farpoint is kind of a mess compared to
It
this one.
is. Yeah, it
At the,
is.
at the same time, like I like this episode. I don't think it's the strongest one.
No,
Uh,
no.
that it's not a great story. It's a good story,
Right.
but I don't think it's a
Yes.
great story.
Correct. I would agree. Yeah.
Okay. Um. Well, Dad, thank you so much for joining me for the recording of this new season. I'm really glad that we got to cover Star the Child for Star Trek season 2. We'll be back next time for Star Trek season 2, episode 2, Where the Silence Has Lease.
Yes.
Thank you for joining me, and I hope that we'll see everyone again soon. Thanks. Good night.
Thanks, Jay. Good night. Bye bye.